In this lesson, what we're going to do is move away from examining the ways in which the Communist Party actually managed to take control of power within Communist China, and start to look at the agricultural and industrial changes that takes place under the Maoist regime from 1949. Obviously, this is the beginning of the consolidation of power, to around the year 1965, and then we will talk about other post-industrial changes that are made afterwards. But then after this particular series of lessons, we're going to focus quite heavily on the impact of the Cultural Revolution, which is, of course, very significant. So, again, as I mentioned, in our first topic for this course, what we did was spend a good amount of time talking about the ways in which Mao and the broader CCP was able to establish communist rule in China from the end of the Chinese Civil War in around November 1949, to look at the different internal policies that took place, talk about things like such as the 100 Flowers campaign, as well as the early economic changes that were made, and then examining through the lens of international events such as the Korean War as well. Well, in this next series of lessons, we are going to explore some of the internal domestic issues that took place during the early period of Communist China, namely looking at the economic issues related to agriculture and industry. So this lesson specifically is going to focus on agricultural policy. Early agricultural policy will tie into some of the ways in which agriculture was collectivized in the next lesson, and we talk about the forcible collectivization and the establishment of these giant cooperatives in order to try and collectivize agricultural policy as much as possible. But in this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the early changes that were made, and also focusing on the general ambitions that Mao had when it came to agricultural policy. Because Mao wasn't stupid. He knew what was his aim for agricultural policy versus what he believed was attainable, and he learned from other communist states in these different ways. So, in 1949, Mao was in the position to examine the successes and failures of the agricultural policies that existed in other communist regimes. So, for example, he saw how successful or unsuccessful, in some instances, agricultural policy was in the early years of the Soviet Union. So we don't cover the Soviet Union in this series of lessons in any great detail, but he was under the impression that if implemented poorly, communist agricultural policies could lead to mass resentment as well as famine. So one of the things that happens in the 1920s in the USSR, in the Soviet Union, is the collectivization policies that were implemented by Stalin that led to the famine of the Holodomor in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, where potentially tens of millions of people in the region of which would now be today Ukraine would starve. And so Mao had this sort of this hindsight, if you will, when it came to the impact of certain agricultural policies if implemented poorly. So instead, Mao sought to walk a fine line between maintaining support for communism in the countryside, where the majority of the support came from in the first place, and then also trying to seek to increase food production to allow for industry to flourish, because he realized that when it comes to economic policy, you have to examine it through the lens of both agriculture as well as the building of Chinese industry. So essentially, Mao made the claim that Chinese people had stood up as a reference to the growth in prosperity of the Chinese population. But it was still the case that the vast majority of the Chinese population, the vast majority, were peasants working in agricultural settings. As a result of this, agricultural policy is very important. You want to keep people on side because the vast majority of the population worked in these different industries. So we see a number of agricultural policies and ideas related to agriculture take place between 1949 and 1957 during this sort of early period. And we can really delineate them into two main categories. We have these ideas that relate to criticism of landlordism and the attacks against landlords. We'll go into them in this lesson and the next lesson. And then we also have a specific policy that was initiated, which is the Agrarian Reform Law. So one way in which Mao was able to present a positive light of communism was to take a pejorative view against landlords. So this is one of the ways in which he was able to frame communism as something that is positive for agricultural workers, and obviously landlords being something that is against and negative and antithetical of good communist agricultural workers. So he presented them as feudal class enemies and sought to destroy communist policies using wealth redistribution. And so as a result of this kind of idea, this kind of propaganda would start to feed into the ideas that was presented at a lower level. And this sort of resentment of landlords and critique of landlordism was something that became quite strong. Within the CCP, we have what are known as work teams who would be sent to the smaller villages, and they would encourage peasants to attack landlords in these so-called struggle meetings. If you remember back to some of the earlier lessons, we had these struggle meetings where people came out and they were forcibly forced essentially to repent for the wrongs that they had committed against the people, against the feudal class, and all of these different things would happen, these struggle meetings. And essentially, a number of these landlords would be publicly shamed, and they would be forced to give up their land and to distribute the land back to those who worked it. And even in some of these struggle meetings, we would eventually see a number of landlords be sentenced to death, and we'll get onto that in a little minute. Moreover, when it comes to actual policy and an actual thing that was passed was the Agrarian Reform Law. Now, what the Agrarian Reform Law did, it was introduced in 1950, by the way, was the first step in creating what became known as a system of peasant land ownership. As such, this law did a number of things to both landlords, so sort of implementing the ideological biases against landlords into practice, as well as the broader idea of redistributing land. So they removed all the legal protections for landlords. So there was no longer any kind of legal recourse or remedy that was in place with that a landlord would be able to utilize for the purposes of getting some kind of remedy for any kind of damages. Land was also taken from landlords forcibly and redistributed, again trying to create this system of peasant land ownership. So when we talk about looking at the evaluation of the Agrarian Reform Law, there are different ways in which we can understand it. Of course, we have to look at the consequences of the law through the intended purpose, the lens of the intended purpose, and if we do this, we come to the conclusion that the consequences of this law were generally positive. So by summer of 1952, so a couple of years after the passage of this law, the land had been redistributed to 65% of the population. Sorry, not 65, 60% of the population. There was also an increase in agricultural production. So between 1950 and again to 1952, total agricultural production increased 15% per annum, so 15% year on year. And so as a result of this, these were the general ideas and the general purpose of the Agrarian Reform Law. They wanted to redistribute land to peasants to create a peasant-owned land-based system. And as a result, we see that 43% of the land being distributed to 60% of the population, generally quite positive for this, again, looking through this lens. And then also, we see increase in agricultural production, 15% year on year between 1950 and 1952. However, if we're going to take a more holistic view of this particular piece of legislation, there were consequences to the introduction of this law. Now, attacks on landlords actually would lead to a great number of targeted attacks for violence. Work teams around the country that would go around and encourage these struggle meetings against landlords were encouraging peasants to act against the landlords to hold their land. And as a result of this, and as a result of these different struggle meetings, as a result of the Agrarian Reform Law removing legal protections from landlords entirely, and as a result of the general ideological and propaganda policy of attacking landlords, between this early period of communist rule, between 1 and 2 million landlords would die as a result of all of these different factors of early agricultural policy. Now, the next lesson we're going to essentially just pick up from where we leave off in this lesson, because What we're going to do in the next lesson is talk about the process that takes place that takes us towards the collectivization of the of land for agricultural purposes. Again, Mao was very conscious of the fact that there ought to be a method in which we collectivize land and not just go in it willy-nilly like Stalin did and ultimately possibly lead to the deaths of millions of people. But we also see the ways in which land was forcibly collectivized and cooperatives were forcibly created. And that's what we'll all explore in great detail in the next lesson.